Hi everyone, I'm Liz Haywood and I'm the designer of this pocket pattern. This pocket can be used in 3 different ways. If you're making a skirt or pair of trousers that hasn't got a pocket or can't have a pocket put on it, you could insert it into the waist, like this one I'm wearing here. And I've done a left and a right for this skirt. You can also sew a channel at the top and thread it onto a belt and wear it through belt loops or just around your waist. Or you could also sew a separate waistband onto the pocket and tie it around your waist like this. And with all of these you could have one or a pair of pockets. Welcome to this sewing tutorial for the pocket. I'm going to run through some suitable fabric choices before we get started sewing. So denim is a good choice, like this pocket is. You could also use the bottoms of a pair of jeans if they're wide enough, because the bottoms of the leg are often less worn out than the rest of the jeans, so that would also be a good choice. Cotton drill is also good because it's nice and strong and not too thick. You could also use corduroy. You could also use wool, like this pocket. However, make sure the wool isn't too thick, because you can see how bulky things can get at the corners, especially this corner here and up here. So wool is great, but make sure it's not too thick. This is what I'm going to be using for this tutorial. It's like a heavyweight chambray. I would probably use it to make a heavyweight shirt in. And I've deliberately picked a fabric that's different on each side, so you can see. And I'm going to be stitching the whole thing in red thread so that you can see what I'm doing. For the bias binding around here and this side strip, you have a few choices for what to do. For this, I used the same bias binding for both, and I used this lovely bias binding from Japan. It's really lovely to use. And I just sewed the strip on the side like this and then use this for binding, so they're both on the bias. For this wool skirt I used linen, just some scraps I had from something else, and this is on the bias and this part was on the straight. If you live in Australia, wide bias binding is sold as hem facing, and I did consider using this, however it's fairly thin, and I'll show you why I decided not to use it. See how it's see-through? So when the edge is bound, you'll see a line of light and dark, so that's why I didn't use it. So if you can't get bias binding this wide, do consider using a strip of fabric, and linen is what I would probably recommend, as it's very pliable and easy to use. Let's have a look at the pattern pieces together. Here's the front with the coin pocket, and this pocket has a left and a right, so you can see that this here is a left hand pocket. So you could cut a pair, or you could cut either a left or a right. The back is simply a rectangle, and it has a dart which you'll need to mark on the wrong side. There's mine, there's the dot for the dart, and there's the 2 marks at the top. You'll also need to mark on the right side where the coin pocket's going to sit. So you can see that it will sit like this when it's sewn together. So this is quite easy to mark. You can just sit your pattern on top and fold back on the line, mark with chalk, mark with chalk. The gusset's simply a long rectangle. It has got a notch on each side here and here, so that you have got pivot points when you sew it to the pocket. If you are having a channel at the top so you can thread it through a belt, you'll need the channel. So far it's looking like this. Channel, the back, the front, the coin pocket, then the gusset will go around like this. And you'll also need a strip for the side here, and I'm going to use the same fabric, but I'm going to use the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm also going to use the same fabric for the binding but the wrong side, and that will go around like that. You can see that I've already overlocked around all these pieces ready to sew. It will make it much easier, especially if you're using something a bit thick like denim. Overlock around all the pieces except for this edge of the front and the side strip, and you won't need to for the binding of course, but everything else. And if you just graze the edge with your overlocker, you can see that you can still easily see the notches where you have them. Take the back and sew the dart in the back from the top down to the point, and you'll notice that the dart sits exactly in the center of that rectangle. And then I've already done mine, as you can see, and then press it to one side away from your coin pocket position, so it sits like that. Now take your coin pocket and you'll have a notch here and a notch here, and that will give you a guide to folding down the top there on the notches, and then on the straight side we want to stitch 1 centimetre down like that, and then we're going to turn it through to the right side. Here it is stitched, and then I'm just going to fold this through to the right side and poke out the corner neatly. Alright, and then I'm going to press that, and then I'm going to stitch a hem across here. It's now pressed and stitched, and when I was pressing it, I pressed 1 centimetre to the end here. So now I have a coin pocket which I'm going to put on the back, and just align the top corner with that mark you did, and you'll see it goes over the end of the dart. So we're going to sew down around to here and reinforce these corners with little triangles so that they're strong. And here it is stitched. The tops of these triangles is probably about 2 stitches along each, and then I've stitched in the middle of the overlocking around here to keep it nice and flat, and all this part here will be hidden inside the pocket. And the back looks like that. We're going to start by sewing the binding on the curve opening of the front, and I just want to say that if you have a preferred method for sewing bias binding on, by all means please use that if you're comfortable with it, and I'm going to show you how I did mine. If you're using a bias strip, I recommend ironing in half first with the wrong sides together, and you can also do the same thing if you're using purchase bias binding. It's a little easier, I think, to put on if you iron it in half first. So I'll show you how to sew on a strip, and also this. So this is the wrong side of the pocket, and we're going to stitch it on around here, and you can see that when it's stitched on it will fold over to the right side like this. I'm going to be stitching this on where this pin is, halfway between the crease and the raw edge, which is like a centimetre seam allowance. If you're using purchase bias binding, you can stitch on the crease that they have already made for you along here, and that will fold over beautifully. If you're using a bias binding like this that has like a shorter bit folded in, you'll need to experiment with where to stitch. So you'll need to just step this back from the edge a little bit. So do that, and then pop a pin in where you'll sew, and then fold it over and see where it lands, because you want the whole edge to be encased in the bias binding. What we don't want is the bias binding, if you sewed it on here, if we just match the raw edges for example, then when you sew that on, see how there's like an empty bit of binding at the top? We want the whole raw edge encased with, to be filled with binding. Here it is stitched on, and when you sew this part here where it's most curved, just pull the bias binding a tiny bit tighter. Not super tight, but just put a tiny bit of tension on it so that when it's folded into place it won't splay out, it will sit flat around the curve. And then on the straighter part, just let that sit flat, both edges together as you sew. So now press all this way towards the binding. Here it is pressed, and while I was there I pressed in this edge so that it will just fold over neatly onto the first line of stitching. And now I will just edge stitch this in place around here. Please feel free to use pins to pin it in place, and you just want that fold to just cover the first line of stitching, which won't be as obvious because you will have used a matching thread. And here it is stitched and pressed. It will improve when you press it because that will smooth out this curve. Take the gusset and fold it in half long ways with the right side on the inside, and press a crease along here so these edges are perfectly matched, and then we're going to just edge stitch along the crease. Here it is stitched. You can see how far away from the edge I stitched, and then that holds the crease in the middle of the gusset so that when the pocket's finished it will stay tucked away out of sight. We're going to sew the gusset to the front now, and we're going to sew it right sides together. So on the gusset there are notches, and that indicates the corner here, so you know where to pivot. So pop a pin 1 centimetre in on your notch and match that up with the corner. So we'll start sewing from this end here, come to here, plunge the needle down where the pin is and take the pin out, and then snip halfway into the seam allowance on the gusset, and then you'll be able to pivot and stitch the remaining side. And just to clarify, have the gusset uppermost when you stitch and the front underneath so that you can see where to pivot and snip. Here it is stitched, and you can see where I snipped into my seam allowance to pivot. Now you'll need to turn that corner through and press this so that it has a fold like that, and you'll get a good firm crease if you press this open first and then over. Here it is pressed, and you can see that gusset wants to neatly sit behind the front now. And when you're at the corner here, fold the seam allowance in a square shape so that it sits folded into the corner. We are going to sew the gusset onto the back now, but pay attention here because we're not sewing the right sides together like a regular seam. We're sewing the wrong side of one to the right side of the other. And I'll show you what I mean. When we sit these here, how they're going to be finished, you can see if we tuck the seam allowance in here and in here, see, we're sewing the right side of one to the wrong of the other. So if we bring that through, you can see when we sew, we'll have the wrong side of both facing up, like that. And the gusset is sewn on just in the same way as you just did for the front, where you pivot and snip at the corner and sew the whole thing around. Should look like this now, with the gusset folded underneath, and if we look on the inside, you'll see that we've got right sides stitched to wrong sides. We're going to sew the gusset at the corner now so that that corner will sit neatly flat. So come to the inside and hold the gusset between those two corner points. We're going to stitch in and out, and with these seams, if you flip one way, one the other, they should just nest together on the stitching line. And the apex is going to come in 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch. And when you come to the apex, take smaller stitches for strength. Here we are, all stitched, and the reason for these small stitches is that we're going to snip in now to the stitching, and we're really creating a weak point, which is why we wanted extra strength at the apex. We're nearly there, and we're going to sew this side seam now. So come through to the inside and fold the gusset along that edge stitching line you did, and flip one side of the gusset seam one way and one to the other so that these seams nest together neatly and it's not so bulky. I'm just going to pop a pin in there and then just let this sit up to here. Now you want to get your strip and lay that right side down. Oh, hang on, I'm using the wrong side of my fabric, so I'm going this way. Right side down. And we're just going to stitch through 1 centimetre all the way down, all the way through to the gusset to the very end here. Here it is, all stitched. I hope I didn't confuse you then with the right and wrong side. So on my strip, this is my right side, and I've placed the right side down. If you're using bias binding for a strip, take an iron and iron it flat. Iron out all those creases so you've got a flat strip, and then use that instead. At the very bottom here, fold that up onto the front along the gusset stitching line like this, and then just stitch over the top again so that that is folded up there, and that will give you a fold in like this at that corner. Turn the pocket through to the right side and give this seam a good hard press, and then at the top part press that whole seam allowance away from the side strip so that it's pointing towards the back. And then we're going to edge stitch along here on the back all the way down the whole length of the pocket strip, and that will help the pocket strip sit nice and sharply on the edge of the pocket. Edge stitching complete, and if you start at the top you'll find it's easier to stitch down into the pocket to the bottom of the strip. Press the strip in place along that seam and then press under an amount here, even all the way along. We're going to edge stitch that down, and it doesn't really matter how much you press under as long as you cover this seam and you don't get in the way of the coin pocket. So you could go just a little amount and have it wider, or you could go big and have it just covering the seam. I'm pinned and ready to go, and once again, if you start stitching from the top you'll find it easier to stitch down into the pocket here. And here it is, all stitched and pressed, and the back looks like this. You can see that line of understitching you did before. There's one last thing to do, and that is just to baste this across the top here to hold that gusset in place for whichever way you're going to use this pocket. You'll see the binding should fit nested in with the dart like that. When you stitch, start at this end and get these points exactly on top of each other. Use a long stitch and stitch within the 1 centimetre seam allowance. Well done, you've finished. Hope you enjoyed it. If you're going to make a pocket to wear on a belt, you'll need a channel to slip the belt through. So you'll need this piece. And the first thing to do is to hem these 2 short sides and go by the width of this pocket so that they'll match. So just press under a hem each side so that the whole thing is level here, and just machine stitch a hem. There it is hemmed. We're going to stitch this to the top of the pocket along here. We could just fold this in half and stitch it along the top and be like this, but this would create a lot of bulk, especially if you're using a thicker fabric. So the way I'm suggesting is that is a little bit flatter. So we're going to stitch this side first, then bring this up, and then stitch the other side down flat like that. So let's just stitch this side along and match these ends perfectly. Here it is, stitched on and pressed, and press everything up that way, and then just bring this over and lap it over the seam you just stitched, and we're going to pin through here, and we're just going to stitch in the ditch, and that will hold the back of that nice and flat. We're stitched in the ditch and we're done. If you're making a pair of trousers or a skirt and you want to permanently insert a pocket in, make the pocket before you sew the waistband on and align the side with the side seam of the skirt or trousers, and then sew the waistband on through all the layers like this. if you want to put a tie on the top, pin it on first and then check the length of the ties, because they don't need to be the same length each side. You can see mine aren't. I cut mine 8 centimeters wide and I didn't put any interfacing on, and then I stitched one side on here, bagged out the ties, and then folded it over and stitched it down.